And welcome to the show, everybody. I'm Joe Concha, and joining me tonight on the Daily Wrap, we have the best and brightest minds in news and politics. Born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama. Roll Tide. But now, a full-fledged New Yorker. She's an author. She's a journalist. She's an all-around classy lady, as far as we know. Jennifer Crumpton is here. Jen, thanks for joining us.
I'll never tell.
Okay, very good. And you might know him, well, we all know him, from a column in Forbes, and he also has a national radio show on Sirius XM Radio. Rick Unger is back. Rick, thanks for joining us.
Can we talk about that Go Tide thing? Can we maybe change that to Go Bucks?
Absolutely.
Yes,
not.
yes.
Thank you.
That's in the T block, actually.
I'm good.
And last but certainly not least, she has interviewed some of the biggest names in the world on her show, Close Encounter. Lisa Janovich joins us. Lisa, how are you?
Great to be here.
Thanks for being on the show. We appreciate it. We got a great show tonight. We have two new panelists as opposed to last night. Rick hasn't left, literally. It's the same suit.
I've been here for the past 24 hours. Yeah.
Outstanding. Well, everyone, again, welcome, and let's get started with your daily download. Well, President Obama is certainly ruffling the feathers of Israeli supporters or supporters of Israel after he announced during an interview with ABC's Jonathan Karl that he would not be meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu while he's in the U.S. next month. Let's listen to John.
I speak with Prime Minister Netanyahu all the time. We're declining to meet with him. I'm declining to meet with him simply because our general policy is we don't meet with any world leader 2 weeks before their election. I think that's inappropriate, and that's true with some of our closest allies. David Cameron, who's got an election coming up, recently came to visit because we insisted that if he wants to come, and it was a very important meeting, he needs to be far away enough from the election that it doesn't look like in some ways we're meddling or putting our thumbs on the scale. To the broader issue, Fareed, I don't think there's been any rebuttal of my argument. I haven't heard a persuasive rebuttal of my argument that we crafted very effective sanctions against Iran specifically to bring them to the negotiations table to see if we could resolve the Iranian nuclear issue through diplomatic.
And obviously that wasn't Jonathan Karl, that was Fareed Zakaria of CNN. Well, as you heard, the president defended opening relations with Iran in the video as well. Let's talk about this. Rick Unger, President making a misstep here?
No, I think he actually put it well. There's been so much hubbub about this. People seem to have forgotten the reason that the president opened these negotiations. It was to keep us from having a nuclear-armed Iran. And suddenly the meme is gone, well, he's done this and that. None of us know anything that's been agreed to in these discussions. I suggest we at least wait until the March deadline. And I think that Bibi Netanyahu would do well to also wait until that deadline happens before he comes and speaks to Congress.
And that will be happening in March.
When he's late March.
Yeah, to speak before Congress.
It just won't help him in his election if he waits.
Yes, as you said. When is that election, by the way?
I think the second week of March, if I'm not mistaken.
I think it is.
Okay.
2 weeks after his planned
speech.
Speech.
But the reason that when President Obama gives a reason of not meeting with Netanyahu being that it's too close to his election and that we generally don't meet with leaders when it's close to that is not necessarily true, because President Obama himself met with German Chancellor Angela Merkel in 2009 prior to her election or re-election, and Bill Clinton in 1996 met with Prime Minister Shimon Peres before his election. So
I don't think anybody believes that's the real
That's not
reason.
right to say that, and it's such an important issue to be able to speak with him at this time. That
well, I think he also mentioned, that he speaks with him on an ongoing basis, and I think a lot is made of the tension between the two right now. But I think we also have to look at the legitimacy of focusing on Iran right now. I mean, we have to face the fact that we're living in a different world. No longer do grandiose, tough statements and only sanctions hit the mark anymore. We're going to have to look at being there, being involved in discussions, being in diplomacy that will actually allow us to have a hand in what's going to happen. They're going to get nuclear weapons either way, most likely, whether we keep slapping sanctions on them or not.
I think that's
we might want to
very,
be at the
very
table.
true.
Right.
That's very true. I like what you just said and how you just said it. To your point, I don't think anybody buys it, as you're saying, that this is the reason. The reason's simple. What the Speaker of the House did and what Bibi Netanyahu did was simply bad politics. It wasn't the way to do it. I understand the speaker's angry at the president, and this is his way of getting even. But you know what? The presidency is going to be here long after President Obama is
So
gone.
you think that Netanyahu should not be speaking?
Absolutely not without the president saying, "Come along."
I completely agree. And what happened to all that talk about cooperation when the Congress was just inaugurated, a couple weeks ago? Who were the first people to make the first misstep and not cooperate and do something
Are you
completely
shocked that it
avant-garde?
might be the Republicans?
Not at all. And I'm wondering what Bibi thinks he's going to get. Is he going to get up in the poll from meeting with Boehner?
Actually, he does think that, and I think he's wrong.
Well, I think as long as he thinks he has a stage, a platform in which to make his case, he's happy with that.
Well, although members from both sides of the aisle continue to hammer President Obama's foreign policy agenda, he firmly stands by it.
What I've found effective is to apply steady, consistent pressure, even as we are getting business done that needs to get done. And oftentimes that makes some of our allies uncomfortable. It makes them frustrated. But the trend line is one that I will sustain throughout the rest of my presidency, and that is to make an argument to those friends and allies of ours that if they want a society that is going to be able to sustain itself in this age, then they're going to have to change how they do business.
Now, Rick, you listen to that side, and we look at President Obama's first 6 years in office. Did he kill Osama bin Laden? Yes, he did. However, Syria is on fire, and we've seen what's happened in Egypt and Libya and all around the globe. Bin Laden, yes, obviously is a big deal, but if you measure that against everything else going on, what would you grade the president right now, 6 years in on foreign policy? I have about 15 seconds.
Great question. Very hard to answer. I don't know that I would grade him particularly well in terms of overall foreign policy, but you know what I would grade him well on? He's killed way more terrorists, way more bad guys than the president before him or any president in our history.
Well, I always found it ironic that he criticized the previous president for torture, but has
then
no
followed
problem
the same policy.
killing. Well, yes,
And is use more drones.
Right, use more drones, so there is no trial, there is no torturing, you're just going to kill them outright. So I always found that interesting that the Doves suddenly report
fair.
drones, but they had a big problem with torture. So anyway, great discussion, guys. Thank you. And we will discuss this and much more right after the break. We're just getting started here on the Daily Wrap. Don't go anywhere. Joe Concha in New York. Great panel, great time. Back with more in just a moment. Joe, the White House surprised many yesterday when, I swear, ABC's Jonathan Karl asked Deputy Secretary Eric Schultz about the U.S. negotiating with terrorist groups. Watch and listen.
You see, the United States government does not give in to demands, does not pay hostage, does not pay ransom. But how is what the Jordanians are talking about doing any different than what the United States did to get the release of Bergdahl and releasing prisoners held at Guantanamo Bay to the Taliban, which is clearly a terrorist organization? The Taliban is still conducting terrorist attacks, so you can't really say that the war has ended as far as they're concerned.
Well, I'd also point out that the Taliban is an armed insurgency. ISIL is a terrorist group, so we don't make concessions to terrorist groups. We feel
the Taliban is a terrorist group?
I don't think that the Taliban is an armed insurgency. This was the winding down of the war in Afghanistan, and that's why this arrangement was dealt. Our view is, as the President said at the time, which is, as Commander-in-Chief, when he sends men and women into armed combat, he doesn't want to leave anyone.
It just exudes confidence, Eric Schultz, doesn't he? I've actually never heard of him before, and suddenly he's doing.
Bless his heart, as
Yes,
we would say.
trying to
So-
handle Jonathan Karl. So what do you think? We have two rules here, actually, and one is age before beauty, and the other is to respect your elders. So we're going to begin with you, Rick Unger.
I've been getting this all day, this age thing, but you know what? What can I say?
When you're
It's
surrounded
true.
by women in
I
their
know,
20s, that's what happens.
I know. So look, I have to break with my pals over at the White House. That was the dumbest thing I've ever seen. You know what? If people throw acid in little girls' faces, they're terrorists.
Wow.
So it's pretty much as simple as that. The real truth here, and what nobody wants to talk about, the age of not negotiating with terrorists, it's over. And nobody will cop to it. There are going to be situations where you have to negotiate with terrorists to get people back. Prisoners of war are nothing new. Prisoner exchanges are nothing new.
What about the precedent it sets, though, when you
The
start?
precedent was set thousands of years ago. We're no longer at war with armies representing countries. We're at war now with armies that have no country.
But the U.S. has a policy that says that we will not negotiate with
doesn't
terror
hold
groups.
up anymore. And by the way, we've never kept it. We've negotiated with terrorists ever since they took over TWA flights, and we would negotiate with them then.
Well, and I think releasing prisoners from Guantanamo Bay was also a very different statement to make at the time. I mean,
we
there's
don't leave prisoners behind, even if we think they may not be the most perfect soldiers.
But releasing them for the 5 Gitmo prisoners, releasing him for that
If
was
it
worth.
was your son, was it worth it?
Well,
Yeah,
you
that's
know,
a difficult. Yeah, that's a tough situation.
so many
But you
sides
have to
to
look
it.
at it. A president has to look at the whole national
Understand.
implication.
And I think also we're just coming off, having ISIS demand millions of dollars for hostages in Japan and elsewhere, and there's a big difference between funding ISIS with
Right.
millions
With
of
$200
dollars
million.
versus a prisoner swap. But I
Well,
have
one of those Japanese men, by the way, lost.
Yes,
he was
he did.
beheaded. They did not negotiate in that
That's
situation.
right. They did
Jenny.
not. They did not, which was very interesting
Well,
to
you
see
have
what
the
they did.
Jordanians now
And I
doing
don't think
negotiating.
the
Right,
United
pilot.
States would obviously not do that either. But
Well,
I
they
think,
won't.
I used to work for a counterterrorism organization, and I do have to say, in Eric's defense, bless his heart, I do believe he was a little unprepared for that statement.
a little.
He's a spokesman. I mean, it's not actually his job.
He wasn't ready for
things
that
happen.
question.
He was not well prepared for that question. The fact is that counterterrorism geeks do have very specific ways that we look at different terrorist groups. And while they are all terrorist groups, they are known by different levels of
degrees.
activity.
How do you look at the Taliban?
Not degrees.
Jenny.
This is very subjective across different policy organizations, and
Can I give an example of what they did last month in
No, they are
Pakistan
they
last
are
month?
absolutely all terrorists. I'm not denying that.
Okay.
I'm just saying I think that he was thinking about the fact that we can quantify certain terrorist groups by how they behave,
And what
where
I'm
they
saying
behave.
is
How bad they
the
are.
degree that they are. In Northwest Pakistan last month, because girls were going to school, they decided to raid one and kill 132 school children.
That's a
All
terrorist.
right, think of
It is
Newtown
very
times
much
6.
terrorist.
So as far as what you're saying, Jenny, in terms of degrees, all right, one being
I don't mean degrees of
pickpocketers, 10
badness.
being the worst human beings on the earth.
can we-
I got to put the Taliban at the 10.
I don't mean
Right,
degrees
right.
of badness. I mean they describe them differently by the type of activity that they tend to carry out. Now, I'm not making any excuses for Eric.
know you're
He
not.
was poorly prepared.
Can we go to the White House tomorrow and ask Eric to explain Deflategate to us?
We're going to bring our show. We'll talk to the producers and see if we can bring the show on the road tomorrow to ask Eric Schultz out for that, and maybe some lunch and get to know him a little bit and see how his internship is going. That could be a good idea. Meanwhile, people, did you see Al Jazeera America has told its producers and reporters to stop using words like terrorist, militant, Islamist, and jihad? Well, according to National Review, who reported the story, the memo from an exec at Al Jazeera America, said one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Lisa, what do you make of this?
It's like the terrorists have the best PR firm ever to be able to, and their reasoning is, again, that to some people, isn't it really only to other terrorists that they are their freedom fighters? To what rational civilization are they not?
The problem is, Rick,
Terrorists.
if I could jump in, that Al Jazeera America went on the air last year. You know how many people watch that network per night? Total. I'm not even talking about, not 3. 18,000 people watch that network per night. It is a national network. It took over from what Al Gore had there before Current. They're down 50% from Al Gore's network. Right? That's like having one win as opposed to 2 wins in the NFL. It's just, and when this sort of thing gets
some
out,
of us used
you
to go
already
on
had a
that network.
branding, you already had a branding issue because they decided to call themselves Al Jazeera. So people are going to flock to it in America, of course, because it was seen as an Al Qaeda, basically an extension of their communications team.
Well, look,
right?
I think.
And now when this gets out,
But
no American's going to watch that
Look,
network.
it sounds really silly. It does. But I do think Americans would do well to understand a few nuances. I actually talked to Christian Bale about this after he played Moses in Exodus.
Really?
And he was attacked for saying that
You know
Moses
Batman?
was I do. He lets me wear his ears. He was attacked for saying that his character Moses, when he got into Moses, was a freedom fighter, which he was. I mean, they're all throughout the Bible. So, I think Americans would do well to kind of consider the other person's perspective solely, if not because you can't fight your enemy if you don't get in their head.
Yeah.
If you don't know what they're fighting for, how are you ever going to go out
And
there?
on that note, we have
That was
to
good.
end it there. Jenny
was
Crumpton,
good.
I did
That
not
was good.
see that coming.
Word.
Coming up next, we're going to do our own amateur handicapping of the GOP presidential contenders, all 74 of them. And is it time for Sarah Palin to step out of politics? All that and more on the Daily Wrap. Please don't go anywhere. We got a great show, and it's going to keep on going in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, right out of New York City on a cold winter night.